Hello, friends. I want to tell you about the incredible benefits of IGF-1. The older we get, the less IGF is produced by our body naturally. When you're born, you have tons of it, and it's why you feel great in your 20s. The great news is that you can replenish it. Just like multivitamins that you take every day, you can supplement the natural IGF levels in your body. You can do that with clinically proven IGF-1 Plus from Neutronics Labs. This is the stuff that helps you regain IGF-1 and feel great. Just spray it into your mouth a couple of times a day and boom. Lean muscle gain, healthy weight loss, more restful sleep, positive energy gain, crystal clear thinking, all of these things. These are the benefits of proper levels of IGF in your system, which naturally you lose over time. Go do the research on your own at neutronicslabs.com. You can get incredible benefits when you put the product on auto ship, and you can cancel anytime. You should try their IGF for at least 3 months to see the positive results. Click the link in the description and use code FKN to save 15%, as well as buy one, get one free with auto ship. Order now at neutronicslabs.com. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Michael Flem. First, a couple of announcements. You can get the Forbidden documentary, Occult Louisiana, on our OTT site. Just click that link in the description. You can rent or purchase it. It'll also be available on multiple streaming platforms very soon. We're hoping to start production on the next film this month. Any assistance would be greatly appreciated. You can help in many ways. If you make a donation of $20 or more for production, you're going to get a free PDF of Cory Hughes' book, A Warning from History, as well as a download of the first film, Occult Louisiana. You can also help by purchasing the film from our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. The film is also available with a Rokfin premium membership. With that membership, you get access to all our premium content and all the premium content from every creator on Rokfin. Finally, I am booking guests for late February and March. If you have suggestions or you would like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today, I want to welcome Michael Flem. He is a best-selling author, adjunct professor of history and philosophy, and columnist for New Dawn magazine and kennedysandking.com. Michael, welcome. How you doing?
Hey, I'm good, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. I've been looking forward to this. We're going to talk about your book, Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. And discussing insights and discoveries about our ancient past is one of our favorite things here. And the historical accounts and writings about Atlantis can include everything from advanced technology and civilizations to psychic phenomena and metaphysical understandings beyond what we currently display. And this book covers much of that. We're going to get to as much of that as possible, but this is your first time on. Before we get too far, let the audience know about yourself and your background and what brought you to write the book.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. My background is I was a professor. I was an adjunct professor of history and philosophy, Western philosophy, for about 13 years in Chicago. And, I couldn't really tell you why I decided one day to really start investigating this. It's not something I've even really understood. It's kind of, I think as time went on, as I was teaching, you run against some questions when you teach, say, a survey course on the history of civilization. And, even if you have discretion over what books to pick, are you going to start with Sumeria? And as I started teaching, I remember, I think it was my second year, was when Göbekli Tepe was unearthed. Even though it had been previously acknowledged, it really started to get a lot of traction. I remember in the middle of my own teaching career. And, I had read Graham Hancock's books and had a kind of passing interest in alternative history, so-called, although I wouldn't call it that. I would just call it history and good investigation. But I really, about 8 years ago, started to look seriously at this question and read as many books as I could on the subject. But I was kind of realizing that, there were really two camps, even of people that acknowledged that this could be real. And those were the kind of, as you mentioned, the metaphysical, clairvoyant camps. And then the more traditional, let's just look through the dry catalog of sources from antiquity on Atlantis, or any kind of mention of a alternative timeline to mainstream history. But I really wanted to bridge those two gaps because, or rather bridge those two fields, because I thought that there were a lot of people who would be open to admitting the kind of remote viewing clairvoyant evidence if it were presented in a way that was not, for lack of a better word, woo or Miss Cleo meditating with crystals. And I say that lightly, but, there are a lot of charlatans and a lot of people who claim channeling authority who, even if well-intentioned, could very well just be influenced by popular culture or things that existed. So what I wanted to do was see who were the first people ever that we're aware of that really started talking about this. And that really led me down a very interesting kind of path, because I discovered a book that I don't think has ever been really studied very well, at least in my survey, which was A Dweller on Two Planets, which was a channeled text that was written in 1881 and never published in the author's own lifetime. And, many people look at that text and say, well, that's just a very interesting science fiction story from a 17-year-old kid on the California frontier in the Wild West. I categorically disagree, and, dedicate a whole chapter in the book to really unpacking what this person said about Atlantis, why he was compelled to write it, and what we've discovered now that he couldn't have known in 1881, geographically, culturally, even oceanographically, what he said, not knowing what the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean looked like, because it had just been mapped 5 years before and not on any sophisticated level. And so it was really my attempt to show people that, look, it's not just my opinion that somebody sat on a couch or had a clairaudient or clairvoyant vision and said, I had a girlfriend with a past life in Atlantis, which is what I think most people think when they hear channeling. But it was really an attempt to show people that, look, the government has used remote viewers to great success. That's abundantly clear through declassified records with the DIA, for example, and the CIA with Operation Stargate. And you can see that for yourself. That's public knowledge. And the people I selected were not people that could have been influenced by anything previous to them. When Edgar Cayce put the date of the Great Pyramid, for example, at 10,400 BC, that was before Robert Bauval proposed that. That was before anybody had really revised that date. To my knowledge, he's one of the first people to ever say that. And I would tend to believe him because not just the internal story he told was coherent over many dozens of years, but that he himself was studied by scientists from Harvard, Stanford. Medical doctors used him in cases that they couldn't solve. He's the most studied and documented psychic probably ever in Western history. And had no passing interest in ancient history when not in trance state. Had a 8th grade education, was not a ancient Egyptologist or anything like that. And when you compare some of the other things he said about, say, mineral deposit depths, missing people, even ancient river systems that were not even known at the time, in 1932, when he was saying them. And then you find out that they were later confirmed in the 80s by satellite imagery. I mean, it really lends credibility to his other more fantastical claims that there was indeed this antediluvian civilization that was utterly destroyed through multiple destructions, culminating in very likely a comet impact. And then when you corroborate that with what, say, Plato, the most famous, progenitor of this story, who himself was simply transmitting a story told to his distant relative Solon by way of Egypt, they themselves say the same thing. They put the date at 9600 BC, and they say a comet struck the Earth. And you've mythologized that in Greek history as the myth of Phaeton, but it really happened. And so what I tried to do was just kind of pull all these different things together and present it like a museum curator in a way that an expert or somebody who has never studied this subject can go from ancient history to today and see how the story evolved with the passage of time. And then also see, well, what are the strongest arguments for and against it? And do we treat this subject differently than we would treat any other ancient history subject just because the time scale is seemingly fantastical? And that was kind of one of my main goals in the book, was not just to say, look, this is real and this is why you should believe it. In fact, I approached it just as a complete outsider, as a mainstream historian, and wanted to see for myself, but I would be lying to myself if I said after 7 years that there's no evidence that this thing existed. In fact, there's quite overwhelming evidence that it did exist, but because of the rate of decay of physical things and the timeline, the only thing remaining would probably be exactly what we find, which is megalithic architecture, cultural clues, and, as Graham Hancock calls them, fingerprints of this civilization.
Right, and you mentioned the time frame and the timeline that this civilization could have existed. Let's start there. How far back should we be going when we're talking about the onset of the Atlantis civilization?
It's a great question, and it's always one that I have to preface with, I can't make that claim. The oldest, let's say, written record, if you will, would be, say, there are some pre-Platonic sources from India. There's the Egyptians' King's List, the Turin King's List, that mention a pre-9000 BC timeline that stretches back potentially millennia. But the clearest case of when it started and how it, over multiple iterations, was destroyed, because in my investigation, I identified 3 destructions of a once much larger continent-sized landmass in the Atlantic Ocean, that by the time Plato got the story was whittled down to 3 small islands. But the first iteration, according to, say, Edgar Cayce, who gave 500 readings on Atlantis, was somewhere around, as incredible as it seems, 100,000 BC. When he claims there was pretty much a large continent where the mid-Atlantic ridge is today, that stretched roughly from the Gulf of Mexico to where the Azores are. And that was destroyed, according to Cayce, in a very specific date at 50,722 BC. That's the date he put. It turned into 5 large islands, one of which would be where the Sargasso Sea is, but still kind of subcontinental islands. The second destruction he identified at 28,000 BC, and the final one sometime around 10,000 BC, which is in accord with Plato, when the final 3 islands were submerged or destroyed in a comet impact. Now, what was going on at 11,000, or I'm sorry, at 100,000 BC? I don't claim to know. I've read all the Cayce readings in this particular case, and he identifies basically a quite primitive group of people who are just trying to figure things out. But given enough time, in each of these 3 iterations, they all kind of go through their own, you're talking 20,000 plus year time spans. Think about how far we've come in, let's say, 7,000 years. Mm-hmm. They all basically get to or beyond our current technological limit. And in the first 2 destructions, and I'll leave that to readers of the book to find because they're quite interesting, those were human caused. The third was natural and kind of global, whereas the first 2 were local but catastrophic because of the technology malfunction. So, yeah, he focused really, because Edgar Cayce, for people that don't know, was a turn of the century and really active in the 20s and 30s, clairvoyant, who could put himself in a hypnagogic trance and was, as I mentioned, studied and has affidavits. It's not my opinion, and was fortunate enough to have a stenographer with him during every of his, 15,000 readings, 500 of which dealt with people's past lives in various parts of the world, but Atlantis being one of them. And, he didn't give these readings for fun. He gave these readings to help people evolve emotionally and spiritually. As a Christian, he thought that, look, if you know what you did in your past life in Atlantis or Rome or the time of Jesus, you can kind of avoid that in this life and grow from that. And it might help explain some of your proclivities and struggles. And so a lot of the people he, got as clients, he put at the third destruction, which was the kind of final battle. And it's fascinating, Chris, the parallels between the third iteration of Atlantis and Star Wars. Because I talk about that in the book, that I have no evidence that George Lucas and his writers were influenced by the Edgar Cayce stories of Atlantis or the Frederick Oliver stories. But it's unbelievable how similar the 2 are. And that got me thinking that perhaps it really is some sort of like Jungian collective consciousness that comes out in fiction, and we call it Star Wars. But I always tell people, remember, the premise of Star Wars is not the future. It's a long time ago.
Yes.
Right. Well, so I wonder about that, really legitimately, that in Cayce's account, instead of the Sith and the Emperor, it's the sons of Belial and their leader. And instead of the Jedi, it's the children of the Law of One. But they function identically. And this is 40 years before the franchise was created. And then in Frederick Oliver's account from 1881, he's talking about, I'm on a ship. I'm on an aluminum cigar-shaped ship that can go in the water and through the air without flight surfaces. And I'm speaking to my girlfriend, who's a princess, through a holographic mirror, as he describes it in his 1881 language. And you're thinking, this is Star Wars. They're describing it, but where is he getting this imagery? He's living in 1881. Where is he getting imagery of cigar-shaped aluminum flying craft and holographic projectors and crystals that power the island? And I find it very difficult to explain. And people say, well, it's just fiction. And it's like, well, why didn't he publish it in his lifetime?
Yeah, that's
why
a good
did
question.
He didn't make any money. His family didn't understand what was going on. They expressed great interest, like, why are you going to your bedroom every night instead of, having dinner with us, and writing this book backwards in his own admission. He says parts of it were written backwards, parts of it were written out of order. I lost my friends. I thought I was going crazy, but I was told to do this by this occult preceptor in the shadow of Mount Shasta, which is, a sacred site that many people have identified as a strange, kind of place, strange energy around Mount Shasta. And he was writing in the shadow of Mount Shasta. So it's like, I don't know, I'm still very skeptical. I've reread my own book and thought, this is interesting, but I can't claim to know the absolute truth, but at the same time, I think a lot of people get this idea that because you can't prove it unequivocally, then therefore it's false.
Right.
Which is just, to me, the sloppiest form of thinking, and to be a professional debunker, my favorite kind of clown out there, it would presume that you are in possession of all knowledge, and you speak every language, and you're, not just smarter than every author that's, written about this, but you're smarter than Plato, you're smarter than Francis Bacon, both of whom believed in the reality of Atlantis. So it's like, I doubt that. I frankly doubt anybody alive today is, categorically more intelligent than Plato or Francis Bacon. And yet these people make a kind of amateur career out of calling people like me or you or hundreds of other authors crazy for just looking at what actually was written and saying, hey, these people have made quite an interesting point, and we should look at it for what it is instead of just throwing it in the bin because we haven't found a circular capital city that says welcome to Atlantis at the bottom of the ocean. Yes, which we will never probably find.
That is the problem we face, but because of wonderful researchers like yourself and many others that are digging deep and relentlessly trying to uncover these truths, we're inching a little bit further towards academia with some of this information. Now, you mentioned that the reality of some aspects of Atlantis was comparable to Star Wars, and this is one of the areas that some people check out on and some people become more interested in, is how advanced was this civilization, and the possibilities that it could have been not only limited to certain areas, but possibly a global civilization?
It was a great question. And again, it requires a very long-winded, I'll try to keep it as short as I can, but, a very nuanced answer, because if, let's say our civilization ended right now, and you, for practical purposes, call our civilization 8,000 years old. If you go back to, say, the Sumer Valley to 2024, okay, and you're in 10,000 years in the future. Okay, well, and you hear that we had rockets that could land and nuclear weapons and all this. Okay, we had that at the end of it, but we didn't have it for the first 7,900 years. So it's like when people say, well, did Atlantis have high technology? Well, according to channeled sources, which are the only ones that talk about the high technology, because if they indeed had it, it wouldn't exist because it's still made of physical material like aluminum, metals, glass, unless you, of course, looked like Christopher Dunn at the Great Pyramid structure itself, missing certain technological components in the King's Chamber as a technology, which I believe it certainly was. Then, if you fast forward 10,000 years, are you going to find, SpaceX in Brownsville with the rockets? No. Are you going to find the evidence of the space program? No. You're going to find the Hoover Dam, which is one of the only megalithic structures we ever built. Then you're going to find, pot shards and arrowheads and things like this from other cultures that predated us. So I always tell people, the only reason I give credence to the high technology aspect of Atlantis is because the people that said that also said other things that are verifiably true. So if Edgar Cayce says they had flying machines, I just don't say, oh, okay, well, some man sitting on a couch who was studied by his research group said it must be true. It's like, well, the Vedic texts talk about Vimanas. The Hopi Indians mention a flying disc that flew and destroyed a city and then disappeared at incredibly high speed. The Hopi Indians said that. Professor Michael didn't say that. So you have numerous cultures with the memory of advanced flying machines. But the other reason is, in Frederick Oliver's account, to answer your question directly, he begins his story in the year 11,160 BC on the principal island of the Atlantean Empire, which was a global empire called Poseid, which I find interesting because in Plato's account from his two dialogues, a lot of people think that the island he was talking about was simply Atlantis, a small island, which again is not small. It's still basically twice the size of England and situated at a latitude that would make it actually the ideal mid-Atlantic empire base. If England could control the world through the British Empire from a cold, freezing North Atlantic island, double the size of England, put it about 500 miles south, you certainly could have a military empire. And so in Plato's account, it's chariots, Bronze Age warfare. They sail in triremes. I don't pretend that Plato talked about that high technology. He didn't. He described it as at the end, they fought with Bronze Age weapons. And so I understand people say, well, where is all this Star Wars, stuff coming from? Well, in Frederick Oliver's account, which was the key to it all to explain the high technology, he says, my story starts in 11,160 BC. The culture was destroyed in a global cataclysm about 1,500 years later, closer to Plato's timeline. And he says in that time period, the decline from this high technology with crystal power grids and flying craft that could be trained to a kind of enormous crystal lighthouse that would create flight paths and move you around the earth and under the water. He said, as time went on, the elite divested themselves of materiality in a kind of weirdo, transhumanist, Klaus Schwab kind of way. He said they became as electricity. That's how he described it in 1881. And they basically left the masses to themselves. And he says all these things we had, he even describes a smartphone. He calls it a name, N-A-I-M. And he says all the wonders of Poseid, the name, the holograph, the flying machine, fell into disuse because the people didn't remember how to build them, because they were built on a separate island by an elite class who left us alone. And he says by the end of it, the time Plato was referring to in his Critias and Timaeus, we had regressed to fighting with spears and horses and chariots. Just like today, if we had a global EMP attack or some sort of power grid, who would remember in 250 years how to make the internet work? I don't know how to make the internet work. You need a whole infrastructure with electricity, with skilled specialists. And once they're gone, we don't even store things in books anymore. So entire knowledge bases would be lost. And it's very likely we would regress to Mad Max in less than that time. So that's my answer. And at the height of it, which he placed around 11,000 BC, they had a principal island with the circular city. And his story takes place on this principal island, which he and Edgar Cayce, who was not familiar with his work, called Poseid, and said there were three islands, Poseid, Arion, and Og, but Poseid being the city with the famous circular capital. And he says in this city, we had monorail rapid transit. We had university system. We had magnetic brain reentrainment of criminals, because through our advanced knowledge of phrenology, we could identify which part of a person's brain was making them commit violence. And again, this is in the age of phrenology, so people might say, hey, that's screwed up. But he describes seeing this event where the criminal justice board of Atlantis is re-entraining somebody who had committed a crime to not do that again through this very weird, like mesmerism type process. He also talks about the flying machines, the weapons, and the other high cultures that existed at the time, of which Atlantis was only one. And he says, in Atlantis, we really went towards material sciences. That's what we excelled in. But we could never defeat this other culture, which he called Suern, which was probably where modern, say, India, Pakistan is today, because he says they had mastered spiritual and metaphysical things on a level higher even than us. So for them, it wasn't about building the next advanced flying machine because they could just astrally project to any place they wanted. It wasn't about building the next advanced missile system. And he's talking about guided missiles in 1881. He says, because when we tried to attack them with our Veil fleet, and the Veil was VAILX was the name of the cigar-shaped flying craft, he said they could just turn around the missiles in their head. And again, it reminds me of that scene where the Emperor, in Star Wars is shooting the blue electricity and he's making the Star Destroyers fall in that final horrible remake of the Star Wars franchise. And it's like, I think this is so appealing to people. Like, that's the most popular, probably, science fiction franchise ever. Same with Lord of the Rings, and I even include a letter from Tolkien to a fan where Tolkien says, the story of Plato's Atlantis influenced me when I wrote Lord of the Rings. And I still have nightmares of seeing a cataclysmic tidal wave sweep over the land, in a letter he wrote to this fan named Christopher Bremerton. So I think, the two most popular science fiction franchises in the 20th century, one incidentally, but one directly, come from this kind of like epigenetic trauma that we probably did go through. And I think that's why these stories, and even just the Marvel franchise in terms of like the superheroes and the abilities people have, I think on some level, these things did exist, and that's why we're drawn to them. It's not just a kind of like futuristic projection. I think it's a recovery, as I call the book, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. I think it's a recovery of like a primal memory of when we didn't have these limitations, and I think that's still in us. And it's kind of frustrating to us. Like, why don't we have Jetsons technology like people in the 60s thought we would have by now? Or is the government in possession of this technology, but it's just militarized and in a special access program? And, it's interesting to see how that plays out as time goes on with these whistleblowers. But it's like, I think absolutely this is a story that definitely merits serious discussion. And it's not something that's just to be taken frivolously. It's actually a very important missing piece of the recorded historical timeline.
Now, aside from the accounts of Edgar Cayce and Plato, what were some of the other sources that you looked at when researching for the book, and how advanced some of these ancient civilizations were?
Yeah, I looked through everything. I include about 7 pre-Platonic sources, just in case anybody thinks that Plato made this up to justify his vision of, Athenian triumph against the Atlanteans and this. Again, I always tell people the story of Atlantis comes from Egypt, and it's quite fascinating that Edgar Cayce, who had no knowledge of ancient Egypt, puts Egypt as one of the 3 global reboots of the Atlantean culture, because in his story, they had foreknowledge of the destruction through their own clairvoyance, but also through what he calls communication with the people from the outer realms. You can figure that out. Could be extraterrestrial, could be interdimensional. I don't know. But they were forewarned hundreds of years in advance, some of these people. And also just people saw the writing on the wall. And so many of them went to different parts of the world. He identifies Yucatan, the Basque country, where they have a non-Indo-European language that's very highly related to indigenous languages in the Yucatan, which no one has been able to explain, but that makes perfect sense if they're all survivors of the Atlantean, mid-Atlantic continent, actually. And then Giza, and in Cayce's story, one of his main subplots, if you read all the 500 readings like a weirdo, like I did, and put them on a storyboard so that the reader doesn't have to, it's like a sub-story. This migration to Giza, building the pyramid, which took, he claimed, 100 years using magnetic levitation technology, not slaves, with the indigenous people who already lived there, and then outside invaders from the Carpathian Mountains. And this really weird, it could be a movie itself, kind of Stargate, SG-1 type reboot of Atlantis in Egypt that itself later evolved into dynastic Egypt thousands of years later, like 7,000 years later. But he categorically denied that Khufu ordered the construction in dynastic Egyptian times, because people asked him that point blank. And, it's interesting because as time goes on, other people who don't use clairvoyant evidence have suggested similar timelines, like Robert Schoch with the water erosion on the Sphinx, Robert Bauval with, hey, if you look at the alignments of the 3 pyramids in Giza, they point to the constellation Orion, but not today, in the year 10,450, which is exactly where Edgar Cayce said it was in midpoint of being finished. And then, of course, you've got the kind of strange cultural connections between like Yucatan, Mexico, and their indigenous language, and then this bizarre language that comes, according to the Center of Basque Studies that I contacted when I was like, hey, look, does anybody know where the hell this language comes from? And they're like, no. And in fact, we even wonder if it's an Atlantean language. They say that on their official website of the study of Basque, the Center for Basque Studies of the University of Nevada. And, how could a man with the 6th grade education in 1932 who didn't seek fame or fortune, in a hypnagogic trance being medically measured with his heart rate near a coma state, say they went to the Pyrenees Mountains, they went to the Yucatan, and they went to Giza? And it's like, those are incredibly good guesses. He didn't say France, he didn't say Germany, he said this one region where the Basque language emerges, And so as the book progresses, you go from the kind of, okay, here's the source book, what all ancient writers said about Atlantis. This is what the Egyptians said. This is what the Indians said in the Mahabharata, where they call it Atala, before Plato, long before Plato. So there goes the argument that he created it. And then let's see the geographical, archaeological, cultural evidence that supports that. And I'm not saying it's all perfect, but like 90% of the things I found corroborate these clairvoyant visions, and I always use two examples, one from Frederick Oliver, one from Edgar Cayce. And the one from Edgar Cayce is quite remarkable. I mean, he said in 1932, somebody was asking him, describe what the world looked like in, 10,500 BC at this time. Like, describe the continental configurations and everything. And so he describes North America and the sea levels being different. And out of nowhere, he says, oh, and by the way, the Nile River used to flow from where it currently is straight through Central Africa and empty into the Atlantic Ocean near the Congo side of the country. And his stenographer wrote that down and filed it away. Well, in 1986, Space Shuttle Imaging Radar determined, indeed, that's true.
Wow.
And buried 6 feet under the Sahara Desert is an enormous, the size of the Amazon river system that empties into the Bight of Benin on the Congo side of the country. And it's like, that's a significant data point. Another one is Frederick Oliver, when he's describing the Atlanteans and their achievements. One of the things he says is, and this is 1881, he says, what most people don't realize is they look at the Amazon and they think that's a beautiful, pristine wilderness, one of the last in the world. And he's talking to his contemporary readers in the 19th century. He says, but actually, it's an Atlantean garden. And many of the species there were transplanted from the Atlantean homeland and cultivated. Okay. That book doesn't get published for 40 years. 2020, a team of international scientists studying botany in the Amazon, and I cite the article, it's from the BBC. They say, we just realized that the Amazon jungle has been cultivated agriculturally for at least 10,000 years by an unknown culture who appears to have transplanted many unindigenous plants to this region. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. That's a lucky guess. Yeah. He didn't say Honduras. He didn't say Mexico. And so you start to add these things up, and then you start meeting other people who, through their own research, like in laboratories with clairvoyance. I contacted a lot of people at the Monroe Institute or at the, Dean Radin's group at the Stanford Noetics Department. And it's like, they don't think this is crazy. They get millions of dollars to study clairvoyance. It's very difficult for the average person, but we know from declassified government records that people can remote view, not even in a trance state. That just happened to be the way Edgar Cayce did it. Frederick Oliver claims he just heard a voice in his head while waking and just dictated what this voice told him, automatic writing. Now, again, I understand that's bizarre. And if I saw it, I'd probably think but I urge people, read what he wrote and tell me if that's normal for a 17-year-old kid to describe theoretical physics and internal chemistry that I believe is more accurate than our actual chemistry of how the Atlanteans viewed material reality, a theory of the sun and what the sun really functioned as, and this advanced propulsion system that the craft used and all this. And it's like, why would you write that on scraps of paper, put it in a drawer, die, and, not publish it? It doesn't make any sense from a motivational standpoint, which is why I chose these people that had no motive to say what they did. And I didn't really include a handful of channelers from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s who, again, I'm not going to say little credibility on, but less because they could be consciously or subconsciously influenced by reading the original, Right. So they're just there to kind of supplement it. And even the channeling is just there to fill in the details that are missing from the big picture, because I really wanted to know, if this is true, there must be a vision of Atlantis that I can present to the world beyond just Plato's quite dry description of the city and the population. I wanted to say I want to take a snapshot, and I had to go into the clairvoyance to do that. But not haphazardly, not haphazardly. It was clairvoyance that I really spent years vetting, reading biographies of these people to see how other people who lived with them swore under oath, this is really what happened. Like Edgar Cayce diagnosed my son with cancer when no one knew the tumor was in that part of his body. Here's the affidavit. Here's the doctor's signature, and my son is alive because of Mr. Cayce. Yeah, that to me is significant.
He's definitely
that's not
made
a Miss Cleo. Call this number now.
Yeah, he's definitely made some incredible predictions. Now, I want to get your insights into some of the more bizarre predictions and connections that he's made with Atlantis, such as hybridization programs, human-animal hybrids, dinosaurs, possible relations with reptiles, things like that. What are your thoughts on some of that?
Yeah, that's a whole chapter in the book called The Beast Within that even I, when I read, go, man, maybe this is too out there for the average reader. But I'm just reporting what he said. And, Edgar Cayce, he was limited, of course, by the language of his time. So he was giving this particular topic was given in a reading in the 1930s, 1931, 32. So they hadn't discovered DNA in 1932. They hadn't, to my knowledge, cloned anyone, at least not in the official records. But I don't think they had. I think you had to discover a lot more before you could start cloning people. And so when he was describing this project by the kind of Sith faction of Atlantis that he called the Sons of Belial, which itself is a title given to kind of wickedness and evil people in the Bible, with Belial being a kind of Hebrew derivation of the Phoenician Baal or Baal Hamon, who would be one of the Elohim, one of the beings in the Old Testament that, commanded worship and human sacrifice. So he factors in the Atlantean story, which is interesting, that Belial himself is a kind of character, almost like a Palpatine, that you never really see or hear of, but his followers are frequently referenced. And they're the kind of faction that you would equate with, say, the Nazis today. They were eugenicists, they were transhumanists. And, in Cayce's description, it's not just that they were hybridizing people. It's that he claims naturally there were already these like mutants roaming the earth long ago, from when he claims consciousness first came to planet Earth, which he puts at a date of 10.5 million years ago and doesn't say very much about that. And he says for many years after, there were these kind of things, as he calls them, that kind of roamed around. But later on, there were, if you read between the lines, cloning programs where the Sons of Belial were tinkering with these, some already existing, some they were creating with their technology, to create a slave class, and for sexual abuse as well, which was a huge side arc, surprisingly. And I had to dig really deep because, you have to buy an app through the Association of Research and Enlightenment, the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and, look through hundreds of these archival scans of his transcripts. Very few of these readings that I ever cite were in a book. I had to go into the archives for years, and there might be one line out of a 50-page life reading that talks about, oh, and by the way, you were a hybrid in Atlantis in 26,000 BC. And I put that on a storyboard, and that's why it took 7 years, because it was such like a crazy story. But, he says that he calls them things, and then he calls them automatons, which is where I make the link to, well, they didn't have the word clone at the time. So that's the only word he had, was an automaton or a thing. And he says that some of these things had like 4 arms, because they were genetically engineered for housekeeping or farming. Some of them, he says, were, half horse, half man, half bird from the legs down with the hooves of a goat. And again, some of this he claims was natural, some was manipulation. And what's really weird is this part where when they took these things, part of this group took them with them to Cayce. And there became this huge, again, if he was making this up, it's like, it's too complex to be just a kind of side plot, because it's so recurring, this theme. And he's like, because many of the people that asked him for a past life reading, he claims were these things. And that's why they were so drawn to helping sick people today. A lot of his clients were doctors and nurses. And so this one lady comes to him and says, well, who was I in a past life? And he says, oh, you used to have from the waist down feathers on your legs and the feet of a bird. And you were one of the automatons brought to Cayce, but you passed through the temple of sacrifice and the temple beautiful, which were surgical rehabilitation centers, using basically how he describes as a lightsaber, which was an electrical knife that could cauterize as it cuts. That's how he describes it in 1932. And he says, the best we could do is cut your feet off, put a organic recreation of a human foot, and then through all sorts of weird sound therapies and light therapies, perhaps in 5 generations, your children would become closer to how we look today, lose their hair, lose their scales, lose their claws. but he says it was a surgical center to create this idealized form of a human being, which is he claims one of not the existing pyramids. He says this was underground. It was a pyramid that he says might be discovered at some point that's under the sands of Giza. And he says after you were cleansed in the temple, you went to the Carpathian Mountains, where there was a problem with basically satyrs running wild with the hooves of goats. And we received a request for an emissary, and you were to go create a rehabilitation program and fix them and remove the animal appendages. And she was like a 20-year-old Catholic girl in Virginia Beach who was like, probably like, what the F are you talking about? Like I was a bird person, so it makes you wonder. I mean, but again, you look at Greek art, and you wonder, well, these things that we call mythological, like the Minotaur or centaurs or bird people or, jackal people, was this some distant memory thousands of years after this program ended into dynastic times and ancient Greek times or maybe even these things were still in small groups roaming the earth. I don't know. Of course, like anybody, I would like to see the skeletons and the evidence. I'm not a crazy person, but I find it interesting because it's like the way he explains it is actually, we could do that today. And I show that in that chapter, that we have successfully hybridized humans and pigs. And for ethical purposes claimed, well, we didn't bring the embryo to term, but we could have. And it's like, of course we have. In some lab in Ukraine or China, I'm sure there's a pig man running around.
Yeah, 100%.
100%.
Yeah. Now, earlier you were talking about the multiple cataclysmic demises of Atlantis, how it probably went through multiple eras of rises and then falls of civilizations due to some sort of cataclysmic events. You also said that it's likely that one of them was from a impact of a comet of some sort. There's also the theories that it was somehow self-inflicted, that our technology got too great and they destroyed themselves. What are your thoughts on all those?
Well, the only evidence I have of the first two destructions is from Edgar Cayce. And I'm sure people are sick of hearing that, but bear with me on that. The third destruction, which is the classic one, I would say to people, number one, there is quite compelling evidence from mainstream geology, from James Kennett and other geologists, Randall Carlson even, who show that, not just from the nano diamond fragments that they found all over the world, but from the physical landscape of the Americas, that there was a cataclysmic event where millions of tons of water, ice gouged out certain parts of the United States. I mean, Randall Carlson goes into pretty extensive detail on that. But the other thing is, you don't need modern science to come up with that. The Egyptians told Solon a comet hit the earth in 9600 BC. Now, for them to guess that date, which is the official, Encyclopedia Britannica date for the beginning of the Holocene period, the modern end of the Ice Age, how did they know that? If these people are supposed to be primitive, how did they know that the Ice Age ended in 9600 BC? That's problem number one. Number two, they said Atlantis was real, not a myth. Plato specifically says that. Number three, they said it was a comet that you call Phaeton in the Greek myth of Phaeton, and he loses control of his chariot, but it signifies the declination of heavenly bodies that fall to earth and burn everything upon it. That's what the Egyptians said. And it's like, why would we think that's just, lucky guess? It's like, no, they were recording something that really happened to them, that the Greeks transmitted to us. For the first two destructions, Cayce, the first one is crazy. And even I, again, I'm not saying I believe or disbelieve. I'm just saying this is what Edgar Cayce said. And is there evidence of it? I'll leave that to you. He said in the first one, when Atlantis was still a continent, that if you look at a map on my website, basically covered where the mid-Atlantic, because, people always say, well, where is all this? And it's like, well, drain the water from the Atlantic Ocean. It's not just flat. The biggest mountain range in the world is the mid-Atlantic ridge. It's just underwater now. 20,000 years ago, it was 1,000 feet, lower water level, 10,000 years ago, I believe it was 600 feet. So it's like, that would have been the continent. The tops of the Azores would have been the mountains of Atlantis at the northern end. And where Cuba is today and Bermuda and these places would have been other high points, the Bahamas of the Atlantean continent 50,000 years ago. And Cayce says at this time, in a reading in 1932, he says, the world was being overrun by what he calls the animal menace. That's what his trance voice called it, which, if you think about it, is just the megafauna, the Haast's eagles, the saber-toothed tigers, the mastodons, the, unchecked giant predatory kangaroos that lived in, Australia and all this stuff. And he says at that point, an international Congress was called. He called it the Great Congress. And he says that groups of people using primitive flying machines, because the technology changed, it wasn't always Star Wars. He says using what we would call balloons or zeppelins, met at a central location somewhere in Atlantis. And they decided, look, we got to reduce this megafaunal animal population because we can't have civilization with this many, monsters running around the earth. So they decided to use what he called the death ray, which he describes as kind of like a harp, and he calls it a stratospheric weapon. And again, this is in 1932, so he doesn't have a lot of, laser type reference points. So he calls it the death ray. And he says, and it's not clear from the reading if it came from the stratosphere or was bounced off the stratosphere, kind of like how HAARP bounces off the ionosphere. In any case, the goal was we're going to trigger limited volcanic reactions around the world where these animal populations have their food supply and try to destroy them through just kind of limited extinctions of the top predators and this stuff. And he says it backfired because it created a kind of catastrophic chain reaction with the Earth's crust and the magma and triggered multiple supervolcanic explosions that killed the animals. But he said it also precipitated a pole shift that had been in progress. And the weather climactically, ice also came in and killed, which he says they could have just done nothing. And, this climactic change would have ended the animals anyway, but they effed up, blew up the continent in the process, fractured it along the tectonic plates, and it became 5 islands. And I just, out of curiosity, I'm like, is there any evidence of a megafaunal extinction around 50,000 BC in any journal? And to my great surprise, Chris, yes, there is. There is an unknown in the Journal of Quaternary Studies, 50,000 BC plus minus 300 years, there was a megafaunal extinction that to this day scientists have no way of accounting for. And they just say in the article, but we must attribute it to hunting. However, in the traditional timeline of human progress, it doesn't appear that enough people could have been around to hunt this many animals. So it's like, that's a very specific date. He didn't say 50. He didn't say 57,000. He didn't say 49. He said 50,722. And the article says, yes, in this range, there was a megafaunal extinction.
Yeah.
So again, my goal is just to show people, look, I'm going to show you where it doesn't line up. He said some things that have not been discovered yet, or perhaps just he was wrong. I don't know. But I would say more than 90% of the things he said about Atlantis, I've been able to, in 100 years since he gave these readings, corroborate. And that's why I really wanted to write the book, because a lot of people wrote books about Edgar Cayce in the 60s and 50s, because a lot of his clients were still alive. But even in the 50s, nobody could imagine cloning a human with a pig. That's inconceivable. And in 1932, nobody could even imagine atomic weapons or laser weapons. But today we have HARP, we have directed energy, we have cloning, we have all this stuff. So I think it's like the time is right now to revisit this stuff with a fresh eye and kind of dig up all this archival stuff and say, look, when he's calling them things and automatons, he's talking about cloning. When he's saying the death ray, he's talking directed energy weapon, And it's like, it was my job just to use all resources as a kind of, I'm a historian of philosophy, but I'm not just going to write a book on, let's discuss the philosophical impacts of, Plato's Atlantis. It's like, I'm going to go and study anthropology for many years. I'm going to go study, geology with geology books, and then see if each of these fields is, without realizing it, like when those people in NASA found the river system, they didn't know that Edgar Cayce said that 50 years before them. I would bet money on that. They just said, hey, nobody's ever heard of this. And I'm like, that's that river that he was talking about, And so my job was just to kind of piece it all together and present it in a way that was exciting, but also novel, because I had never seen anybody do this,
How do you feel about the future of this information in terms of how academia views it and could possibly present it in the future? Do you see that they may be more accepting these days of this information?
No, I think personally academia, I don't teach in academia anymore. I think the whole institution is, in 30 years will be gone. It will be something like a country club that wealthy people send their kids to, but this idea that because a professor says it means it's, we've lived through so much just our own age, that most people under 30, a lot of people say, well, it's the TikTok generation. And yeah, that's true. A lot of young people don't really do deep research, but at the same time, I think they're a lot harder to fool with appeals to authority. And I think that's a good thing, because academia won't even engage with this subject. They'll teach you Plato. They'll tell you Plato's a genius. Plato's the progenitor of Western philosophy. Everything Plato said was true. Oh, accept this.
Yeah.
And that's why I opened the book with that quote from classics professor emeritus Alan Cameron, who says the entire story of Atlantis is premised on an elaborate Platonic myth supposedly passed from Solon to Plato, end quote. And then underneath that, I put Plato's quote from the Critias, where he says, it's Critias talking to Socrates. He says, Socrates, this is a strange story, but every word of it is true. It was vouched for by Solon, the wisest of the seven sages. So it's like, so you're smarter than Plato. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And the source of Atlantis is the first Athenian reformer, which by definition means he's the first democratic politician really in human history. So you're smarter than Solon. You're smarter than Plato. It's just this kind of arrogance that really drives me crazy, And I think that what I realized was, look, has academia revised their textbooks after Göbekli Tepe? 15 years since it's been dug up? No. Has academia revised their textbooks since, James Kennett proved basically that a comet hit the Earth? No. You know what I mean? So it's like, I don't even think they're relevant. I think they're relevant for specific technical things, but they're horribly incompetent when it comes to piecing together a coherent narrative. Like the Journal of Quaternary Studies, I'm not a geologist. You need specific training tools to discover that there was a megafaunal extinction.
Yeah.
But you're out of your league to tell me that couldn't be human caused because you have not studied Atlantis.
Well, luckily, I think most of society is smarter than we give them credit for and are listening to independent researchers and archaeologists and people uncovering some of this information that's been hidden, as opposed to just blindly believing what academia says. So that's a beautiful thing that seems to be occurring now.
It really is. And I think, a lot of it is going to be like a trickle down effect. I think people have, all but the most ignorant, have lost faith in the mainstream media, particularly in the West. Most people have lost a lot of faith in politicians. Most people have lost a lot of faith in the medical industry. And so it follows that. And I've seen just a kind of natural growth of interest in this subject. Every day I get a letter from somebody somewhere in the world that says, thank you, because I thought I was crazy. Like I actually thought this was real. And anytime I tell somebody, they go, oh, you believe in Atlantis. And they're like, now that I've read your book, I realize that like there's an overwhelming abundance of evidence. It's just I had never seen it put together in a way that wasn't wackadoo. Yeah. It was just factually presented in a very, I think, exciting way. I tried not to make the book, even though it has 400 footnotes. It's not a dry catalog of just, and then Plato said this, and then Socrates, and then it's a story. It's the story of the 20th century, or I'm sorry, of the last 2,000 years of Western history. With what did the Romans say about Atlantis? Did they think it was fake? What did the Greeks say? What did the Indians think? What did people in the Renaissance think? What did people in the Enlightenment think? What did people in the 19th century think as they were rediscovering electricity and all these things that I would argue existed long ago? Mm-hmm. Because it's like, if human beings anthropologically have existed for conservatively 250,000 years, with the same skeleton and brain as you and me for 250, but likely 300,000 years if you go by one record, the Jebel Irhoud skeleton that they found. But let's just say 250,000 years. Well, does it make sense, Chris, that for, like 246,000 of those years, they were just sitting on their ass doing nothing? Right. With the same material conditions on Earth, Yeah. Like they didn't do anything. And then magically the pyramids and law and writing and science and language just appear mysteriously, and it's like, that doesn't make any sense. What an honest researcher would say is like, well, we just don't know what they were doing, which is what I say. I don't know what the hell was going on in Atlantis and McDonald's in Atlantis on Thursday in 114,000 BC. I just say, look, this is what a otherwise accurate, otherwise unconcerned with the topic clairvoyant, who is mainly a medical remote viewer, said about this subject. And most of the things he said were basically verified. So maybe we should look and see if that makes sense. Because there is no way to know. Unless really we find some sort of, the famed Hall of Records, which Cayce says exists in 3 different places on Earth. 3 copies of records from the beginnings, he says, of Atlantis to the final destruction were encoded and stored in secret places. But Cayce said these can't be accessed because they're projected by an energetic electrostatic barrier that measures the frequency of the person trying to enter and would kill you if you could get to it, until the human brain and consciousness has evolved to a point where they won't use that technology for destructive purposes. Right. And again, it's like, okay, if it was real, that kind of makes sense. Like, yeah, we're going to tell you what was going on, but you're not going to get the death ray until 90 or something, after you've stopped like genociding and blowing up shit and like being ignorant. That actually makes perfect. I wouldn't want the Hall of Records, were it to exist, to be in the hands of anybody right now. 100%. You know, because if world leaders, the way they're behaving today with conventional weapons, it's not promising. Yeah. You know, but, you know, I think it's like you don't need the Hall of Records to prove this, because even if the goddamn Hall of Records was opened and there was just a big book, there's no amount of information that's going to convince Michael Shermer that that wasn't planted there. And it's never been my goal, because you cannot convince an ideologue or a religious person. And debunking as a profession is an ideology, has no basis in science, which is tentative by definition. It has a basis in I'm right and I want this to be true. And so it doesn't matter, you know? What is going to be interesting, though, is just as more time goes on, like, will we find another Göbekli Tepe? You know, will we find a structure in the Azores that should not be there, like the pyramid they found in 400 feet of water that no one can explain, that magically doesn't exist after the Portuguese Navy claimed they did a survey of it? And, you know, and I talked to the guy who found that, by the way, with a Portuguese translator. And he's like, I'm not making that up. You can look at this image. Here's the GPS coordinates. And I put a picture in the book. Like, this is the depth finder. This is a real picture of his depth finder. And I used to work on a fishing boat. Like, I know what a reef looks like, and I know what a goddamn pyramid looks like on a depth finder. And indeed, there is a pyramid that would have been above water 11,000 years ago in the Azores, which is where Plato said the principal Atlantean island would have been. So it's like, we got the evidence. I'm just showing the world, look, maybe you've seen this and you've seen that, or you've thought this, or you've thought that, but let me put it all together for you over 7 years and present it in a way where you just got to read it with an open mind and decide for yourself, you know? But yeah, I make no claim to authority, you know, which is, I think, the strength of the book. You know, I just show people and I don't tell them, which to me is what real researchers should be doing, you know, even debunkers.
Exciting things being revealed right now from folks like yourself. Can't wait to see what comes out of the future, just like you were saying. And this was fantastic. Everyone needs to go pick up the book. Before you head out, let them know how they can do so, how they can also find out more about yourself, and anything else that you'd like to put out there. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me on. I hope people learn something. It's available in Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com, mainly Amazon. And you can get it on 4 different versions: softcover, hardcover, Kindle, or audiobook. And also in Spanish, which I translated, and a Spanish audiobook. And if you want more information, or you're interested in contacting me for any questions, I love answering readers' questions. It really is exciting when somebody reads what you wrote and comes up with their own conclusions that you didn't think about. You can always contact me through my website, which is Michael Flem, last name one word.com. And I look forward to, like you, I wrote this for my own excitement. I never even was going to publish this. I, like Frederick Oliver, I just put it in a drawer for years. And I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll make a cover, edit it, and I'll publish it. And to my great surprise, a few months ago, it went to #1 prehistory book in the world on Amazon.com. And I could not believe, because like I said, I never wrote this for money or fame. And I put my own, academic reputation on at risk, because generally you're crazy to talk about this, But in the end, it's been a better career than teaching at Loyola University ever was. Much more exciting. And so there we are. Excellent, man. Michael, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to definitely have to have you back on because we really barely scratched the surface of some of these topics. So we'll get deeper next time for sure. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We will talk again tomorrow, and we'll see y'all then.